It was a Tuesday morning, just after 7 o'clock. The air still carried the cool, sweet stillness of early spring, and the scent of wild grass drifted through the open kitchen window as I stirred my coffee. I had just finished feeding the chickens, and the dog was dozing by the back door. For a fleeting moment, life on the edge of the neighborhood felt precisely as I had envisioned it, quiet, undisturbed, and entirely my own. That tranquility shattered the instant the ground began to tremble. Initially, I mistook the vibrations for distant thunder. Then, a heavy crunching sound on gravel reached me. Far too many vehicles for a simple delivery or a neighbor's SUV. I stepped onto my porch, still clad in boots and a bathrobe, my coffee mug warm in my hands. That's when I saw them. 2 HOA utility trucks, a rented flatbed trailer, and most astonishingly, a full-size drilling rig being maneuvered up my gravel road by 3 workers in orange vests. I remained frozen. They didn't require my consent. They were driving straight onto my property, bypassing the cattle gate I had left ajar for the propane delivery. They showed no hesitation, no inquiry. Before I could even finish my coffee, one of them was uncoiling thick cable near my barn as if it were his own. "What in the blazes are you doing?" I called out. One of the workers, a young man, likely in his mid-20s, sweat already darkening his safety vest, looked up and blinked at me. "Water survey, sir. We have authorization from the HOA board." "This is private property," I retorted. "I didn't authorize a single thing." He simply shrugged. "Take it up with the board. We're just contractors." I strode down the steps, my boots crunching on the dry gravel, and demanded to see their paperwork. A clipboard was handed to me, feeling like a hollow consolation. It wasn't a permit. It was a memorandum from the Oak Summit HOA board, stating they were initiating a neighborhood-wide water table assessment for future drought resilience. In the margin, scrawled hastily, was a line, "Includes undeveloped border parcels within emergency easement allowance." I didn't need to read the rest. My land wasn't part of Oak Summit. I had fended off 3 offers to purchase it. I paid separate county taxes. My original land deed, dating back to the 1940s, when this entire valley was nothing but scrub and cattle trails, clearly indicated my ownership. Yet none of that seemed to matter. The HOA had unilaterally and illegally decided to expand their dominion. The drill roared to life an hour later, a low mechanical groan at first, escalating into a piercing whine that seemed to embed itself in the earth like a pulsing heartbeat. They positioned themselves near the southern fence line, precisely where my old well had once been. I watched them bore directly into soil that had never belonged to them. In that moment, a profound sense of unease settled over me. It wasn't just the unauthorized drilling, it was the unnerving silence that followed. The board hadn't contacted me. No notification had been sent. No email, no letter, no knock on my door. They had arrived as if they owned the very ground. Around 10 o'clock, I finally managed to reach someone at the HOA office, Nancy Tillman, their new environmental project liaison. I knew her vaguely. She always wore pearls to town hall meetings and possessed a brittle, self-assured demeanor that reminded me of the bureaucrats I'd contended with during my time in the service. "I'm not entirely sure why you're so agitated, Mr. McCrae," she said, her voice tinny and indifferent over the speakerphone. "This initiative is for everyone's benefit. We're preparing for long-term drought conditions. This survey was unanimously voted upon and approved by the board." "You didn't vote on my land," I snapped. "You don't own my land, and you certainly don't have the right to drill on it." A brief pause ensued. Then, calmly, she stated, "We have the right under emergency environmental access provisions, which your property falls under due to its location on the aquifer map. You should have received an email." "I did not," I countered. "Well, perhaps you should check your spam folder." I ended the call. I didn't shout or issue threats. Instead, I went inside, retrieved the leather binder containing my land deed, survey maps, and boundary markers. Then, I made 2 crucial calls, one to the county land office and another to Jack Perkins, an old friend from my days working in state infrastructure before my retirement. Jack, ever practical, didn't ask many questions. Text me the coordinates, he said. I'll look at the water rights overlay this afternoon. By noon, the drill had reached a depth of approximately 30 feet. I stood by the fence, arms crossed, observing them pump slurry into the borehole. They were drilling far too deep for shallow groundwater, indicating they were searching for something more significant. The crew chief, a lean man with a clipboard and a sun-scorched neck, approached me. You might want to move your livestock, sir. We'll be pressure testing tomorrow. Get off my land, I stated firmly. He offered a smile, as if I'd made a jest. We'll be done in 3 days. I returned to the house and locked the gate behind me. That evening I emailed the county office again, requesting a cease and desist review, copying Nancy Tillman and the entire board. There was no response. However, the next morning brought a palpable change. The air itself smelled different, acrid, like boiled eggs and wet metal. I initially suspected a septic line issue until I stepped outside and saw it, a thin, yellowish sheen seeping from the borehole. And then there was the silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, only the distant hum of generators and a new, deeper sense of wrongness emanating from beneath my feet. The sulfur had begun to rise, and it was becoming terrifyingly clear that none of them had any comprehension of what they had just unleashed. By the time I reached the bore site on that second morning, the air was thick with the pungent, unmistakable stench of sulfur. It was the kind of smell that assaults your senses and refuses to release its grip, akin to the interior of a rotten egg cracked open on a scorching sidewalk. The drill had penetrated even deeper overnight, and now the ground around the hole oozed a milky, yellowish froth. Wisps of steam lifted in faint, ghostly ribbons. Yet the crew continued their work as if nothing were amiss. They were now wearing respirators, not the flimsy paper kind. One of them, the young man who had initially shrugged at me, had red-rimmed eyes and was coughing into his elbow between shovel loads of wet, sludgy soil. I watched from the fence, my stomach churning, as he scooped the runoff into a black container bearing a hazardous materials label. They were treating this entire situation as a minor inconvenience, not a potential biohazard or a trespassing operation spiraling out of control. I could no longer remain a passive observer. I walked down the gravel path, past my pasture, and along the fence line, until I reached the gate they had breached. Not simply opened, but cut. The lock had been sawn through. A pair of bolt cutters lay discarded just off the path, half buried in trampled grass. They hadn't even bothered to conceal their actions. This was no longer mere overreach. It was vandalism. It was criminal trespass. I climbed through the gap in the fence and stepped into the field. Immediately, the sulfur smell intensified, raw and unfiltered. It clung to the back of my throat and stung my eyes. I pulled the collar of my flannel shirt over my face and pressed forward, my boots sinking slightly into the muck. One of the contractors noticed my approach and turned away, but the foreman did not. He met me halfway, clipboard in hand, his posture radiating an air of injured authority, as if I were merely a grumpy landowner making a fuss. "You're not authorized to be here," he stated. "Neither are you," I shot back. "This is my land. I never granted you permission. You cut my gate. You drilled without a permit. You're removing sulfur runoff without any containment. Do you even have any idea what you've hit?" He blinked, but his mouth continued to move. "We're under direction from the Oak Summit HOA Environmental Committee. They've coordinated this effort in compliance with regional drought mitigation." "Bull," I interrupted. "There's no emergency declaration, no executive order, and this land is not under your jurisdiction. I have a deed and a county map that clearly state as much." He hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "Then you'll need to take that up with the board." "I already have, and I'm quite finished being ignored." That was my cue. I pulled out my phone and began recording. "I want your name. I want the name of your company. I want the name of every subcontractor, and I want to know who signed the work order. If you don't cease drilling immediately, I'll have the sheriff here before noon." He lunged, attempting to knock the phone from my hand. I sidestepped, continuing to film. His face flushed crimson, whether from embarrassment or the toxic fumes, I couldn't tell, but his hand dropped to his side and he turned away. In that instant, I knew he lacked any legitimate legal standing. They were operating under the guise of authority, attempting to bluff their way through with technical jargon and half-truths. That afternoon I drove into town. The sheriff was out, but I left a written statement detailing the events. Then I proceeded to the county recorder's office, where I met with Linda, a quiet, elderly woman I had known since I moved here. She retrieved my parcel file and cross-referenced the latest filings. There were no easements, no permits, no survey records, nothing. "They're operating without a license," she said, flipping through the folder, trying to legitimize their actions after the fact perhaps, or simply hoping you'd give in. I certainly wouldn't. Back at my property, the sky had taken on an ominous hue. The clouds had thickened into a strange dull bruise overhead. From my property line, I could see the branches along the HOA fence rows beginning to wilt, not just on my side, but on theirs as well. The HOA's meticulously maintained tree line, their prize-winning sugar maples, and ornamental ash trees were showing signs of browning at their tips. One appeared to have lost half its foliage overnight. This was more than just sulfur fumes. The groundwater itself had begun to turn. Late that evening, just as I was securing the shed, my neighbor James approached along the easement path between our properties. He was a decent fellow, worked locally, had 3 children, and generally kept to himself. But tonight, he looked deeply worried. "Hey, Dalton," he said, his eyes scanning the yellowing horizon. "Do you know what's happening with the trees? My backyard smells like burnt eggs. My daughter's been vomiting since this morning." I recounted the entire story. The drilling, the sulfur, the unauthorized crews. His jaw tightened. The HOA didn't mention any of that. They just said they were making progress on a community water access program. "Progress?" I scoffed. "They're poisoning your soil." He stood in silence for a moment, then muttered, "I should have voted no." "You had a vote just last week," I reminded him. "They presented it as being for drought resilience, showed us a PowerPoint and said it was urgent, but they never said anything about drilling on your land." He turned to leave, then paused. "Whatever they're doing, I don't think they can stop it now." He was tragically correct. The following day, the first tree within HOA territory collapsed. A 20-foot dogwood planted to commemorate the development's 10th anniversary split at the trunk and fell into a neighbor's yard like a felled giant. Its roots had rotted into black, waterlogged masses coated in the same sulfurous slime I had observed near the borehole. Still, the HOA remained publicly silent. They issued a brief statement in their newsletter attributing the damage to seasonal stress and advising residents to waterless. Waterless when the ground was saturated with sulfur-rich runoff. I printed that newsletter, highlighted the offending line, and tacked it to my wall. Then I contacted Jack again. "This is bigger than a property dispute," I told him. "They've contaminated the aquifer, possibly worse." Jack didn't hesitate. "Send me everything," he said. "Coordinates, video, water samples if you have them. I'll get someone from the state to look into it. Quietly for now." That night, I collected 3 jars of groundwater, one from the borehole runoff, one from my old well, and one from the creek bordering both properties. The differences were already stark. The creek water had become cloudy. My well water carried a faint odor, and the borehole sample looked as if someone had poured lemonade into a pool of acid. I stored the samples in a cooler, labeling each one meticulously. If the HOA believed this was over, they clearly didn't know me. I wasn't merely fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting to expose their trespass, their poisoning, and their lies, and I was no longer alone. 3 days after the drilling commenced, the land began to show its resistance. It wasn't a sudden revolt, but rather a slow, creeping sickness that spread in an eerie silence, as if the very soil had begun to decay from within. The first true indication wasn't the dying trees or the foul-smelling water. It was the profound silence. Birds ceased their nesting. The morning chorus that once roused me before sunrise vanished as if a switch had been flipped. Even the insects disappeared. No crickets chirped, no cicadas buzzed, only the low, persistent hum of the drill, and still operating, still pumping something dark and noxious from beneath my feet. That morning, I stood at the edge of my pasture, coffee in hand once more, But the taste was different. The wind carried a sharp, acrid bite, unnervingly wrong. I looked out towards the tree line where the HOA development began, a landscape once vibrantly, even annoyingly, manicured. Their signature row of red oaks lining the outer boulevard had started to discolor. The leaves curled at the edges, and the bark turned patchy, resembling skin blistered from underneath. I counted 3 trees already shedding half their foliage. This was no seasonal stress. It was chemical warfare from the underground. I walked the perimeter with my dog, Buck, who kept his nose low and his tail stiff. He didn't sniff the grass as he normally would. He moved as if something were profoundly amiss. I knelt and dug into the soil with my hand, barely an inch or two down. The dirt was damp and reeked of sulfur. It clung to my fingers like glue, leaving a distinct yellow stain. I recoiled, careful not to touch my face. By mid-afternoon, a wind picked up from the southeast, carrying the noxious stench deeper into the neighborhood. From my porch, I watched as a mother and her child in the HOA subdivision walked their dog. They suddenly stopped, both coughing, the child clutching her nose. They turned back, retreating, and still the HOA remained silent. That evening, I received a call from Linda at the county recorder's office. "Dalton," she said, her voice hushed. I looked deeper into their filings. Yes, there's a record submitted last week, backdated to appear as if it were entered a month prior. It references an emergency aquifer survey authorization with an attachment that's conveniently missing. It means someone's attempting to legitimize their drilling operation after the fact. I rubbed my temple. "Do you think I can prove fraud?" "Not yet," she replied. "But the metadata indicates the form was edited the same day you called about the fence being cut." That was the opening I needed. The next day, I sent the footage I had captured of the crew, the borehole runoff, and the damaged gate to Jack. I bundled the videos with Linda's findings, the newsletter screenshot, and the 3 water samples, then overnighted the entire package to the environmental lab Jack had connections with in Boulder. It cost more than I had anticipated, but the expense was no longer the primary concern. This was about uncovering the truth. By Thursday, more trees had succumbed. This time, they fell closer to the HOA clubhouse in their prized elm garden behind the tennis courts. 2 of the largest elms in the neighborhood, each predating the development itself, collapsed within hours of each other. One of them toppled directly onto a pergola used for wine tastings, shattering it in half. Residents began to talk. One of them, Denise, whom I often chatted with at the farmer's market, sent me a text. "Hey, do you know what's going on with the trees? The HOA said it's a fungus, but the smell is awful." I told her the truth, and I told her I had proof. Later that night, she replied with something that made my heart pound. "I'm on the landscaping committee. They told us not to speak publicly, said messaging needs to stay unified. One guy quit over it." The HOA wasn't merely ignoring the truth, they were actively suppressing it. Friday morning, I received a call from the lab. "Mr. McRae, we have the preliminary results." "Lay it on me," I urged. The borehole sample shows extremely high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide and ferrous sulfates. The contamination likely stems from a breached sulfur deposit or a degraded geothermal vent. "You said this was a water survey." "That's what they claimed," the voice replied. "Then they drilled far too deep and into the wrong strata. They've punctured something they had no business touching." "And the other samples?" I asked. "Your well is showing early signs of infiltration. The creek water is already compromised." I thanked the man, hung up, and simply sat on the edge of my bed for a while, staring at my phone. Then I reached for my boots, pulled on my jacket, and stepped outside. The neighborhood was no longer the one I remembered. Where once everything was green and ostentatiously manicured, brown patches now crept across lawns. Shrubs were drooping. The HOA had halted irrigation 2 days earlier, blaming it on municipal repairs, but I knew better. They were attempting damage control, but sulfur doesn't stay contained. It seeps, it rises, it kills. Later that day, as I sat on my porch watching another tree collapse across the HOA boundary line, a silver Mercedes pulled into my driveway. I recognized the license plate. It belonged to HOA board member Mark Fisher, the VP of Operations. He stepped out dressed in a blazer far too polished for the prevailing conditions and approached me with the demeanor of a man attempting to control a narrative that had already ignited into an inferno. "Mr. McRae," he began, "can we talk?" "We already are," I replied dryly. He offered a tight smile. "We understand there have been some concerns. The board would like to work with you to address them." I stared at him. "Did you know you punctured a sulfur vein?" His smile faltered. "That's a theory. There's no conclusive evidence. I have test results, an independent lab. You've contaminated the groundwater and killed half your damn trees." He exhaled sharply, as if I were the unreasonable one. "Mr. McRae, surely we can come to a civil resolution here. A landscaping crew could be dispatched to your property immediately. Compensation for the fence may be a small stipend." I stood my ground. "No," I said. "What you're going to do is shut down that drill. You're going to issue a public statement, and you're going to prepare for a full environmental investigation." His face turned cold. "You'd rather take this to court?" "No," I replied, stepping closer. "I'd rather you hadn't poisoned my land in the first place." He turned without another word and got back into his car. But before he drove off, I saw it. The way he looked out at the wilting trees across the HOA boundary. For the first time, he looked scared. And he should have been, because the ground had turned sour, and this was only the beginning. The emails began to arrive that Sunday. They didn't originate from a lawyer, not yet. There were no cease and desist orders, no formal complaints, just a series of community wellness updates sent to the Oak Summit listserv and copied to me. Even though, officially, I wasn't on their mailing list, the subject lines were vague and deceptively cheerful, addressing concerns, tree health and spring transitions, water quality update, all systems operational reminder. Community unity is our strength. It was the digital equivalent of a smile concealing a blade. Each email attempted to reframe the unfolding situation. The dead trees were attributed to seasonal fungus. The sulfur smell was dismissed as a temporary soil imbalance, and the drilling was described as a minor hydrological survey within the HOA perimeter in collaboration with county environmental advisors. There was no mention of me, no acknowledgement of the cut fence, the unauthorized drilling, or the lab results that now resided in my desk drawer under the ominous heading Geochemical Contaminant Alert, Immediate Risk to Soil Integrity. But what truly ignited my fury was the concluding paragraph in one of their emails. "Please do not engage with misinformation being circulated through unofficial channels or from parties not recognized as members of the HOA community. We encourage neighbors to stay informed through board-approved updates only." They were attempting to erase me from the narrative, to paint me as some fringe element, a bitter outsider stirring up trouble. Never mind that their crews had trespassed onto my property. Never mind that my land was now half dead and my well contaminated. They aimed to completely alter the situation, and they were moving with considerable speed. By Monday, members of the Homeowners Association board were making door-to-door visits. I observed from my porch as Nancy Tillman, still adorned in her distinctive white blouse and pearl necklace, approached James's front entrance, a clipboard in her grasp and a strained artificial smile on her face. Her purpose was damage control. James later recounted that they had requested his signature on a pledge of community accord, agreeing not to engage with or disseminate any unverified assertions regarding the water survey or the decline of natural plant life. He declined to sign, but others may have complied. Following this, the landscaping crew arrived. They did not work on my property. Instead, they fanned out across the common lawns of the HOA, uprooting withered hedges and trees, excavating the contaminated soil, and spreading fresh topsoil as if that would resolve anything. Their work was hasty and careless. In some instances, they simply felled ailing trees, concealing the decay beneath them with ornamental mulch. It was a veneer of deception, as superficial as a thin layer of bark. The climax arrived on Wednesday afternoon. A young man on a golf cart, emblazoned with the HOA insignia, hand-delivered a letter to my residence. He offered no greeting, merely presenting a sealed envelope before departing. Within was an official notice classifying my actions as a nuisance, accusing me of obstructing HOA activities, harassing authorized contractors, and propagating false or inflammatory claims that had undermined public confidence. It cautioned that continued behavior could lead to legal repercussions and monetary penalties. Their intention was to silence me. They had infringed upon my property, caused environmental harm, deliberately misled, and now sought to portray me as the source of the problem. I contacted Jack and read him the entire correspondence. He responded with a single, sharp, dry chuckle. He identified it as a classic tactic of pre-legal intimidation, advising me not to engage directly and to forward the letter to him so they could respond through official channels that could not be ignored. He then shifted to a more serious tone, informing me of progress on their end. The Department of Natural Resources was showing interest, albeit discreetly for the moment, and wished to examine the water samples and footage of the incident. They expressed particular concern regarding potential damage to the aquifer. I concurred, noting that the HOA was already attempting to manipulate the narrative. Jack's voice lowered. Then we must ensure the authentic account is presented forcefully and promptly. That evening, I sat at my old desk, poured myself a measure of rye whiskey, and meticulously documented every detail. I recorded every date, every falsehood, every deceased tree, and the pervasive sulfurous odor. I compiled photographs, timestamps, electronic correspondence, and video files, organizing it all as a military report, for that is precisely what it had become, a covert conflict for the sake of truth, and I was determined not to let them prevail through pleasantries and newsletters. By Friday, I had prepared a comprehensive report, essentially a dossier, printed and ready for submission to the county offices and the local press. However, before I could dispatch it, there was a knock at my door. It was Denise. Her eyes were red, her complexion pale, and she appeared to have been without sleep for days. "They cut down the trees in my yard," she stated. I stepped aside, and she entered, clutching a folder of her own. Inside were photographs taken earlier that very morning. 2 magnolia trees had been uprooted. A single sapling had been removed and replaced with a shrub she had not authorized. Her once vibrant backyard garden now seemed denuded and barren. "I told them to stop," she whispered. They claimed it was necessary remediation, yet they never sought my consent. I examined her photographs, then my own. "They are attempting to conceal the evidence," I declared. She nodded. "And the neighbors," she added, "they are frightened. They are being instructed to remain silent, that speaking out will jeopardize property values." I took a deep breath. "Do you wish to assist me in bringing this to an end?" She met my gaze and responded affirmatively. That night we released the initial video. I uploaded a 10-minute compilation of footage featuring drilling apparatus, instances of trespassing, sulfurous sludge, and dying trees, accompanied by a calm voiceover explaining the situation. We omitted any mention of the HOA by name, refraining from accusations and instead presenting facts, dates, and documentation. Initially, the viewership was modest, comprising a few hundred local residents. Then, it gained traction on the state subreddit. Subsequently, the local news outlets shared it on their Facebook page. By Saturday morning, it had garnered 30,000 views. By Sunday, reporters began to contact me. The HOA attempted a response with a prepared statement characterized by vagueness and deflection, citing ongoing investigations and collaboration with environmental agencies. However, the visual evidence was too compelling, the underlying decay too evident, and the odor still lingering and insidious. No amount of mulch could obscure it any longer. They had intended to manipulate me into silence through psychological tactics, but instead I ignited a blaze they could not extinguish. They had mistakenly believed I was merely a cantankerous old man with an abundance of leisure time and a stubbornness as unyielding as granite. That was their initial error. Their second mistake was assuming I lacked the capacity to retaliate. What the HOA board consistently failed to comprehend, what they never bothered to investigate, was that prior to my retirement to this tranquil locale, I had dedicated 26 years to the United States Army Corps of Engineers. A significant portion of that tenure was dedicated to managing water and infrastructure, encompassing drilling protocols, studies on aquifer impact, and strategies for disaster mitigation. I had supervised remediation efforts in 3 areas following floods and reviewed more geotechnical reports than those suburban autocrats had likely encountered in their entire lives. I possessed not only the ability to document a violation, but also the expertise to construct a case compelling enough to necessitate resignations. Back in my office, I retrieved the substantial gray filing cabinet designated USES Retired, which had remained undisturbed for over a decade. Inside were my federal certifications, security clearance letters, and a binder titled Hydrogeological Impact Protocols, Tier 2 Threat Classifications. I had not accessed this material since 2009, but the moment I turned to the section concerning sulfur intrusion, my ingrained professional knowledge resurfaced. The HOA's actions in drilling into a subsurface sulfur deposit without implementing mitigation plans, containment structures, or geological surveys were not merely imprudent. They bordered on environmental negligence. Even more alarmingly, they had conducted this operation on private property, my property. I printed the pertinent pages and cross-referenced them with the visual evidence I possessed. Every indication of hydrogen sulfide exposure was evident. The damage to the foliage, the decay of the roots, the bubbling on the surface, and the discoloration of the water. My earlier water samples corresponded with contamination profiles detailed in EPA documents. Then I recalled another resource, an old acquaintance. Her name was Dr. Emily Harrow. She had been one of the leading analysts at Colorado's Division of Water Resources. We had crossed paths during a joint investigation in the late 1990s, following an incident where a small-town contractor discharged industrial effluent into a protected wetland. She was astute, principled, and unyielding. I still retained her contact information. When she answered on the second ring, her voice was precisely as I remembered, brisk, no nonsense, with a subtle southern inflection. "Dalton McRae," she exclaimed. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in years." After a brief exchange to catch up, I presented the situation, the HOA's actions, what the drillers had encountered, the laboratory findings, and their attempts to attribute blame to me. She did not hesitate or express amusement. "I require the samples, and I need a soil core taken from the southern quadrant of your property. I will dispatch someone tomorrow." The following morning, a nondescript white truck bearing Colorado state plates arrived, carrying a single technician. He was a young man, quiet, wearing a clean jacket that read DWR Field Division 3. He introduced himself as Thomas and requested the geographical coordinates. I guided him to the location behind the pasture, approximately 20 feet from the borehole the HOA had drilled. He set up a compact drilling apparatus, extracted a soil column, and sealed it within a protective case. "You will receive your results within 5 to 7 business days," he informed me. "I need them sooner," I pressed. He offered a curt nod and assured me he would expedite the process. On that same day, Denise returned, accompanied by 2 additional residents, James and a woman I did not recognize named Barbara, who resided on the western cul-de-sac. All 3 had experienced a similar pattern of issues: dying trees, ailing children, and basements now emitting a sulfurous odor. However, they had also observed something else. HOA maintenance vehicles had been engaged in digging in backyards, installing new piping, and removing topsoil without prior notification. "They are attempting to rectify the situation without admitting any wrongdoing," James commented. "They are trying to erase it," Barbara added. Consequently, we began to organize. We established a shared cloud-based folder, naming it Operation Root Rot, a title that was partly humorous and partly defiant. Everyone uploaded photographs, videos, and screenshots of HOA electronic communications. We amassed over 40 individual files within 2 days, each documenting some form of damage or a deliberate cover-up. In the interim, the original video continued to gain momentum. By midweek, we had surpassed 50,000 views. It was at this juncture that a news station from Denver, Channel 9, contacted me for an interview. They were interested in producing a segment on suburban environmental negligence and requested to film at the location. I agreed, but with the stipulation that they must include the angle of sulfur contamination and showcase the dying trees within the HOA boundaries. They arrived with a small crew the following morning, a cameraman, a field reporter, and a young intern who appeared as though he had never encountered an odor more offensive than microwaved popcorn. As we proceeded towards the borehole, the stench struck them with considerable force. The cameraman actually gagged. The segment aired that very evening. The headline read, "HOA drilling gone awry. Allegations of sulfur contamination in Oak Summit." My image appeared on screen, as did Denise's. The borehole, the dark sludge, and the ailing trees were also featured. They even aired footage of HOA landscaping crews removing tree stumps, portraying it as if they were scrubbing evidence from a crime scene. By Friday, the HOA capitulated. They issued a letter to all residents acknowledging a drilling-related miscalculation and promising to collaborate with environmental consultants to evaluate the long-term risks. However, there was no mention of the trespass, my involvement, or the sulfur. They were still attempting to defend their position. Nevertheless, the tide had undeniably shifted. The county supervisor contacted me directly. So too did an attorney from the Colorado Office of Environmental Health. Both assured me they would investigate the HOA's actions more thoroughly. Jack confirmed that the Department of Natural Resources was now formally reviewing the drilling incident under a Tier 2 environmental breach protocol. And just as I thought the week could not become any more surreal, I received a call from a man named Paul Sanderson. He was a land use attorney who had represented agricultural landowners in water disputes across the state. "I saw your interview," he stated. "You have a compelling case, stronger than most I have encountered. Trespass, damage, unlawful drilling, environmental negligence. If you are considering pursuing legal action, I would be honored to assist." I did not respond immediately. I was standing outside, phone pressed to my ear, gazing at the scorched remnants of a once magnificent sycamore that had provided shade to my barn for decades. Its bark was split open, resembling a wound, and a peculiar yellow crust had formed where its roots met the soil. My land was afflicted, my well was failing, and my peace had vanished. However, I was not without recourse, and I was no longer alone. The results arrived early on a Tuesday morning, slipping into my inbox with the subject line, "So sterile it could have been missed." The email contained a DWR soil analysis report, site number 073A. I opened it before my second cup of coffee, still wearing the same boots I had worn while showing Thomas the site. I read every line twice, then again, and then a third time, more slowly this time, allowing the numbers and phrases to penetrate my consciousness with more force than the drill rig that had initiated this entire ordeal. Hydrogen sulfide concentration, 8.3 milligrams per kilogram. Ferrous sulfate levels, 12.5 milligrams per kilogram. Soil pH, 3.9, critically acidic. Organic root death, advanced and irreversible. Source of contamination, breach of a deep sulfuric layer consistent with an uncharted geological formation. There it was, scientific confirmation that what the HOA had drilled into was not some shallow water pocket or harmless stratum. It was the sulfur vein, volatile, unstable, and entirely unsuitable for any surface disturbance. The borehole they had punched through my pasture had unleashed a subterranean infection, and now it was bleeding into every corner of Oak Summit's meticulously cultivated illusion. Attached to the report was a brief note from Dr. Harrow herself. "Dalton, this is grave. Your aquifer is compromised. Your land is the least of their concerns. If they persist in denying this, it will spread until someone becomes seriously ill or worse." And still, the HOA had not ceased operations at the site. The drill remained in place, motionless yet untouched, like an emblem of their arrogance. The yellowish soil surrounding it had deepened in color, cracking in places, with fissures forming in patterns that uncannily resembled veins. One of the landscapers I'd seen earlier in the week had not returned since collapsing on the job and being silently taken away. I forwarded the report to Jack. He called me back within an hour, his voice charged with excitement. "This is invaluable," he exclaimed. "We have them on record. The state cannot ignore this. The Department of Public Health will undoubtedly want to conduct its own inspection, and when they do, they will follow the documented evidence directly to that boardroom." "Proceed," I urged. "Push it." "I am already doing so," he confirmed, "and I have also looped in Paul, your attorney. He intends to build the case into a lawsuit for public nuisance and environmental negligence." "Excellent," I replied. "They wish to portray it as seasonal fungus. Let's see how they explain toxic groundwater and acidic topsoil in court." By that afternoon, the story had already gained significant momentum online. Channel 9's video segment had gone viral, accumulating over 300,000 views and finding its way into local subreddits, HOA watchdog pages, and even national environmental forums. Comments flooded in from individuals in other states, people who had experienced HOAs overstepping their authority, destroying natural landscapes, and weaponizing bureaucratic procedures against homeowners. I was no longer merely a disgruntled old man. I had become a symbol of what happens when individuals with misguided intentions believe they have dominion over everything around them. That evening, the HOA convened an emergency meeting. Naturally, I was not invited, but Denise was. She arrived late at night, carrying a USB drive and a look of utter astonishment. "They are in a panic," she stated, sitting at my kitchen table, her tea untouched. "They are aware of the soil report. Someone forwarded it internally." Nancy was visibly enraged, appearing on the verge of an explosion. They were discussing damage control and attempting to shape the narrative before the agencies arrived. "Shape it how?" I inquired. Denise shook her head. "They are planning to claim the drill was never operational, that it was solely for exploratory purposes, and that any alleged contamination predates the operation. They intend to assert that the sulfur was already present." "Precisely," I responded. I accessed a folder on my computer labeled Day Zero Raw Footage and opened a time-stamped video. The date was clearly visible, the footage sharp, and the sound of the drill boring into the earth was unmistakable. "They will not get away with that," I declared. Later that night, I uploaded a second video. This one focused exclusively on the soil report. I presented the data, the conclusions, and a side-by-side comparison of tree health across the property line. I narrated it slowly, clearly, with a gravity that no longer necessitated anger, only the unvarnished truth. I concluded the video with a single sentence: "Warren, this is not merely about trees. It is about trust, land, and the consequences of unchecked authority." By morning, it had garnered 100,000 views and resulted in a subpoena. This time, it was a legitimate legal document. The Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment had initiated a formal inquiry into Oak Summit's drilling activities. The subpoena demanded all documentation, internal correspondence, permits, contractor agreements, and environmental impact assessments from the HOA board. It marked the beginning of the end. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued to deteriorate. The sycamores near the clubhouse completely collapsed, one of them cracking the pavement in the parking lot and damaging a Mercedes parked beneath it. Lawn care crews were now equipped with protective masks, and HOA residents were beginning to voice their questions aloud. What did the board do? Some approached my door discreetly, humbly. They offered apologies for having ignored the warning signs and inquired about how they could contribute. And for the first time in weeks, I experienced a sentiment I had not anticipated feeling again. Community. The kind that is not manufactured through newsletters and manicured flower beds, but rather forged through shared truth and common interests. We established a coalition, naming it the Oak Summit Restoration Committee. Our purpose was not to merely clean up their mess, but to hold them accountable for it. Barbara volunteered to gather testimonies. James meticulously mapped the affected areas. Denise managed the dissemination of legal updates. I conducted interviews. We had once been just neighbors. Now we were the resistance. The HOA board attempted to convene another meeting, this time private, with no minutes recorded and no residents permitted entry. However, someone leaked the audio, and when Nancy was overheard stating, "We just need to maintain clean optics until the next election," the final thread of their composure snapped. By the end of the week, 2 board members had submitted their resignations. The drill rig was finally dismantled, and a notice was placed in every mailbox. It read, "Due to unforeseen environmental complications, all hydrological operations initiated by the Oak Summit Board are hereby suspended pending further review." Unforeseen, they termed it. But we possessed the soil evidence to refute that claim. On the day the state investigators arrived, I stood on my porch with a thermos of black coffee and observed their convoy approaching. 3 white SUVs bearing the seal of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment were emblazoned on the doors, followed by a 4th truck from the Department of Natural Resources and a marked vehicle from the County Environmental Enforcement Division. They were not here for pleasantries. They were here to build a case. I met them at the fence line. The lead investigator, a tall woman in a navy field jacket and mirrored sunglasses, introduced herself as Agent Moreno. She presented a warrant and a sealed directive authorizing access to the entire drilling site, encompassing both my property and the HOA's side. She was polite, professional, and entirely unswayed by the HOA's public relations efforts. "Mr. McRae," she stated after reviewing my documents and video logs, "we have examined the soil report and the initial footage. There is sufficient cause to investigate this as an unauthorized environmental disturbance and potentially a criminal trespass." I handed her the signed affidavit from Paul, my attorney, detailing the severed fence, the damages incurred, and the absence of any permission for entry onto my land. "I hope you brought cameras," I remarked, "because what you will discover out there has not changed. If anything, it has worsened." They spent the entire day conducting their inspection. Hazmat suits, soil core drills, chemical testing kits. They employed a comprehensive array of equipment. They brought in a portable water analyzer and dispatched a team member to the creek to collect samples from 3 distinct locations. 2 of the officers meticulously traversed the property line with GPS equipment, precisely mapping the areas where the HOA's contractors had operated. Every few minutes, another photograph was taken of a decaying root, a discolored patch of lawn, or a gaping hole where a tree had once stood. By the time the sun set, they had accumulated enough evidence to fill 2 vans. Agent Moreno pulled me aside before their departure. "We have confirmed that the contractors hired by the HOA never registered their equipment with the county. There were no permit applications, no geological survey filings, and no insurance waivers for excavation beyond regulated depths. As far as the state is concerned, this was an illegal operation." She paused, then added, "You may wish to prepare for court." "I already am," I responded. Paul Sanderson had been working around the clock. With each new sample and each confirmed violation, he meticulously constructed our civil suit, encompassing claims of trespass, property damage, unlawful excavation, environmental negligence, and malicious misrepresentation. He even identified grounds for a claim under the Colorado Open Lands Protection Act, which specifically prohibits private developments from disturbing subsurface geological formations on land they do not own without formal consent and oversight. The potential penalties were substantial, amounting to 6 figures at a minimum. However, what was more devastating than the financial implications was the reputational collapse. The HOA had established Oak Summit upon the foundation of an illusion of control, order, and prestige. Now, that illusion had fractured irrevocably. At the subsequent public assembly, an event mandated by the state to be accessible to all inhabitants, throngs of people congregated. Unlike previous gatherings, which had been characterized by the casual offering of refreshments, this assembly was charged with a palpable sense of urgency. Attendees arrived in significant numbers, their demeanor a mixture of palpable anger and profound confusion, their hands laden with inquiries. I, too, was present. It marked the first occasion since the commencement of the drilling operations that I had set foot within their brightly painted beige clubhouse. However, this time I was not alone. The members of the board appeared to be cornered. The weariness etched on Nancy Tillman's face was evident, her makeup unable to conceal the strain. Mark Fisher, the vice president of the Homeowners Association, sat rigid, akin to a statue. The secretary attempted to initiate the proceedings with a rehearsed update, but the assembled crowd refused to allow her to complete her statement. Questions erupted. What did you know about the drilling? Did you vote on this matter? Why were we not informed when the trees began to perish? My daughter has fallen ill. Are you prepared to cover her medical expenses? Who granted you the authority to trespass on that gentleman's property? Despite their attempts to regain control of the room, it was too late. When a motion was put forth to adjourn the meeting prematurely, the atmosphere within the room became tumultuous. It was at this juncture that James, seated in the second row, rose to his feet and proposed a motion to disband the current board, citing Article 9 of the HOA's charter. This particular clause stipulated that residents possessed the authority to remove leadership if gross negligence or misconduct could be substantiated. He produced copies of the soil analysis, the cease and desist directives, video recordings, and laboratory assessments. His presentation was irrefutable. The vote concluded with a decisive outcome: 76 in favor and 24 against. 3 board members were immediately removed from their positions. That very evening, Nancy Tillman submitted her resignation. The following morning, I received correspondence, not from the HOA, but from a legal firm. They were representing a collective of residents who were initiating a substantial class action lawsuit against the former HOA board, citing damages to property, a decline in land valuation, adverse health effects, and significant emotional distress. They extended an invitation to include my case in their claim, an offer I respectfully declined. I had my own personal battle to wage. On that Friday, Paul formally filed the civil complaint. The named defendants included Oak Summit HOA, Nancy Tillman in her capacity as acting president, Mark Fisher, and the unidentified contractor responsible for operating the drilling rig. Our submission comprised property surveys, visual evidence, aerial drone footage, expert testimony from Dr. Harrow, and duplicates of the backdated, fraudulent HOA permits that had been discovered by Linda at the county office. This filing garnered considerable attention, progressing from local news coverage to regional dissemination, and was even featured on a legal blog under the compelling headline, "When Suburbia Drills Too Deep, One Man's Fight Against a Rogue HOA." The interim board, newly appointed to manage the HOA, made an effort to expedite a resolution proposing compensation for land restoration and legal disbursements in exchange for confidentiality. However, the core of the dispute was never about monetary compensation. It was about something far more profound. My objective was to secure acknowledgement, admission, and an enduring record that would serve as a perpetual reminder for each individual involved. Consequently, I responded with a resolute no. Paul, acting on my behalf, conveyed, "We will see you in court." Concurrently, the land continued to exhibit discernible signs of distress. The vegetation surrounding the borehole failed to regenerate. The water from my former well had to be permanently sealed. Hundreds of trees, stripped of their foliage, stood as stark, skeletal outlines against the skyline. Nature does not readily forget such profound injuries. Nevertheless, I remained undeterred. I transitioned from reliance on the compromised well to implementing a rainwater harvesting system. In collaboration with the local ecological organization, I initiated the introduction of sulfur-tolerant plant species along the periphery of my property. My pasture was transformed into an educational resource for schools. Children visited to study the consequences of power abuse and the ecological price exacted upon the land. Consequently, people began to address me by a title I had never anticipated: steward. While this designation was offered as a compliment, my sole desire had initially been for tranquility. Nevertheless, I came to a crucial realization. The act of resistance was not merely about safeguarding my own possessions. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure the ordeal I had experienced. And the prevailing sentiment, the tide of public opinion, was not merely shifting, it was actively washing away the transgressions. By the time summer arrived, the Oak Summit neighborhood bore little resemblance to the brochure Perfect Haven it had once aspired to be. The once lush, rolling green lawns had been supplanted by brittle expanses of straw-colored grass. The verdant trees that had elegantly adorned the winding thoroughfares now stood denuded, devoid of leaves and a somber gray, resembling wooden specters raised in silent protest. The HOA's emblem of pride, the so-called Green Dream, upon which they had built their communal identity, was visibly deteriorating, and the cause was universally understood. The sulfur contamination had not only decimated the soil, but had also irrevocably eroded trust. What had once been a meticulously controlled community, preoccupied with appearances and strict adherence to regulations, had fractured into dissenting factions. Residents polarized into two distinct groups: those who stubbornly clung to denial and those who had confronted the truth and were incandescent with rage at its prolonged concealment. The deniers, largely comprising board loyalists and real estate speculators, endeavored to maintain the facade of normalcy. They engaged private landscapers, imported fresh sod, and dispersed fragrant perfumes into their front yards, attempting to mask the pervasive odor of decay. Yet their efforts were ultimately futile. Nothing they attempted to plant took root. Even artificial turf appeared lifeless against the backdrop of scorched trees, and pavement stained a sickly yellow. Meanwhile, those who had become aware of the extent of the damage began dismantling the remnants of their contaminated hedges, installing drought-resistant native vegetation, and displaying signs bearing messages such as, "My yard is healing. Are there any HOA cover-ups here?" Truth flourishes where authoritarian control disintegrates. I received an invitation to address one of their weekend assemblies. Approximately 30 individuals gathered in Barbara's backyard. Some were seated on coolers and overturned planters, while others stood in small groups, arms crossed, their gazes reflecting a deep-seated bitterness. I eschewed a formal speech, opting instead to share my narrative. I recounted how my acquisition of the land, intended to provide solace, had plunged me into conflict. I explained my initial belief that I could remain insulated from the HOA's influence by simply staying within the confines of my property. I articulated that silence serves as fertile ground for corruption, allowing it to proliferate unless actively eradicated. Tears were shed that day, accompanied by applause. More importantly, however, a sense of unity emerged. Even those who had previously harbored doubts about my claims now grasped that the issue transcended mere arboreal concerns. It was a matter of profound betrayal, of overweening arrogance, and of a system fundamentally built on control finally succumbing to its own inherent flaws. It was at this juncture that the audits commenced. The county, emboldened by the public outcry and the ongoing state investigation, initiated a comprehensive audit of Oak Summit's financial records. The findings surpassed our worst expectations. Over $240,000 in maintenance contracts lacking any discernible accounting, duplicated invoices submitted to companies ostensibly owned by the cousin of a board member, and emergency funds diverted to a beautification initiative that precisely coincided with the illegal drilling operations conducted on my land. The story rapidly gained momentum, becoming akin to a wildfire. The Denver Post published a weekend feature titled "Rot Beneath the Roots: How Oak Summit's HOA Dug Its Own Grave." The subtitle was unflinching, detailing fraud, contamination, and the rise of community resistance. 2 former board members were subsequently subpoenaed. One of them, Mark Fisher, was observed exiting the courthouse with a paper bag obscuring his face, an image that swiftly went viral. His reputation was irrevocably damaged, and his real estate license was suspended pending further inquiry. Nancy Tillman attempted to salvage her public image by participating in an interview on a local podcast. She asserted that she had been misled by unscrupulous contractors and had no knowledge of the unauthorized nature of the drilling. However, when the host inquired about the HOA's internal directives advising residents against speaking with the press, she abruptly terminated the interview and departed. The damage, however, was already irreparable. Property values plummeted, not solely due to the contamination, but also as a consequence of the protracted legal battles, the relentless negative publicity, and the pervasive chaos. Prospective buyers withdrew their offers, rental properties remained vacant, and even the HOA's legal counsel resigned, issuing a discreet yet scathing statement citing an environment rife with toxic liability and ethical compromise. The newly formed interim board endeavored to stabilize the situation. They extended 2 overtures in my direction. The first was a letter requesting my consideration of a collaborative restoration initiative aimed at rebuilding trust and mending the fractured relationship between myself and the community. I did not respond to this communication. The second overture involved a monetary settlement, once again in the 6-figure range, coupled with naming rights for a community garden they intended to establish. This time, I did respond. My written reply stated, "You wish to name something in my honor. Name the crater you left behind, because until you acknowledge the full extent of your actions, you have not earned the right to cultivate anything." I received no further communication. Meanwhile, my land began to undergo a transformation, albeit not in the manner intended by the others. Although the sulfur had indeed spread, I had taken decisive action at an early stage. I successfully isolated the contaminated section, removed the topsoil, and commenced its replenishment with compost and the strategic planting of species conducive to slow recovery. I collaborated with ecologists possessing the expertise to revitalize land on the brink of collapse. Gradually, nascent sprouts began to emerge, wild sunflowers, asters, and resilient prairie grasses. The landscape was not yet aesthetically pleasing, but it was undeniably real. I commenced documenting this process, creating time-lapse videos of the regrowth, which I paired with excerpts from the lawsuit that highlighted themes of ecological resilience and accountability. These visual narratives garnered a significant audience, not only from my immediate neighbors, but also from viewers across a wider geographical expanse. Environmental organizations initiated contact, and the documentary film crew inquired about my willingness to be interviewed. I readily agreed, recognizing that while their narrative of destruction had reached its conclusion, my story of recovery was still unfolding. One day, James visited with his young daughter in tow. She carried a diminutive potted seedling, her cheeks flushed from the sun, her expression one of solemnity. She looked at me and asked, "Can we plant this here?" My mommy said, "Your dirt is getting better." We knelt together near the boundary line, the very edge where the HOA's jurisdiction had once asserted its dominion, and together we excavated a small hole. The soil was warm and yielding. She carefully placed the seedling into the earth, gently pressed the soil around its base, and smiled. "It will be a tree someday," she declared. I nodded, watching the sunlight glint in her hair. "It already is." That evening, I walked the expanse of my land alone. There were no drilling rigs, no contractors, no board members observing from across the fence. It was simply me, the fragrance of newly turned earth, and the faint, distant chorus of crickets, a sound that had finally begun to return. Their idyllic vision had crumbled under the weight of its own hubris, but mine, my own vision, had only just begun to take root. I had never sought to be the focal point of any endeavor. When I acquired this land 15 years prior, it was precisely because of what it lacked: no incessant traffic, no garish streetlights, no tedious committee meetings, no neighbors scrutinizing my lawn's height, no prescriptive regulations regarding porch adornments. It was simply 5 acres of open space, the weathered framework of an old barn, and a profound silence into which one could comfortably retreat. However, following the drilling, the contamination, the catalogue of deceits, and the ensuing legal entanglements, the quietude I once cherished had undergone a metamorphosis. It was no longer a sanctuary of retreat, but rather a definitive boundary I had established, a demarcation not merely on a map, but as a matter of principle. This land was unequivocally mine, and I resolved to shape its future according to my own terms. My initial undertaking was the reconstruction of the fence. This was not a replica of the flimsy wire barrier that the HOA's contractors had so effortlessly breached, but a structure of substance: cedar posts, 6 feet in height, anchored deeply in concrete and interspersed with thick, weather-treated timber slats. I personally carved the wood and branded the gate with the seal of my family name, McCrae Ridge. This alteration did not go unnoticed, not due to ostentation, for it possessed none but because it conveyed a profound message, a declarative statement. This was a territory that would not be encroached upon, deceived, or subjected to surreptitious trespass. The reconstituted HOA board, or what remained of it, dispatched a missive requesting my consideration of removing the eastern fence to preserve the community's visual uniformity. I returned it with a single sentence inscribed across the top. The era of visual cohesion has concluded. Welcome to reality. My subsequent actions extended even further. I eradicated the vestiges of the old pasture fencing and replaced them with indigenous windbreak species, including chokecherry, serviceberry, and lilac. I constructed raised garden beds for vegetables and installed apiaries near the field's furthest periphery. A solar energy array was erected behind the barn. I meticulously excavated a trench and implemented French drains to redirect surface runoff away from the contaminated section of the land, which remained conspicuously cordoned off with warning signs and marker flags. I made no attempt to conceal the damage. Rather, I meticulously documented it. At the very edge of this desolate patch, where the soil still emitted a faint sulphurous hiss, I positioned a bench, a simple, unadorned piece. Etched onto a small stone plaque embedded at its base in bold capital letters were the words, "Here lies what power forgets. The land remembers." The press returned, as did the content creators for online platforms, the activists, and even a contingent of local university students engaged in a semester-long research project investigating the protracted consequences of ill-conceived suburban drilling operations. I permitted them to film, to conduct their tests, and to voice their inquiries. Throughout this process, I addressed every question posed. One afternoon, while guiding a tour for an environmental law professor and her students, a young man posed a question. "Why didn't you simply sell and depart?" I paused, my gaze directed towards the ground before responding. Departing would have been the path of least resistance, and that was precisely their expectation, that I would capitulate, that they could bury their transgressions beneath a veneer of superficial remedies and specious justifications. However, the earth retains its memory, and so do I. Later that evening, Paul contacted me. "The court date has been finalized," he announced. "We will appear before a judge in 2 weeks. I've already been contacted by counsel for the HOA's insurance company. They wish to settle." I leaned against the porch railing, the sun descending towards the horizon. "How much?" I inquired. "They are offering $375,000 and a full written apology from the board. Public record, no non-disclosure agreement, no gag order." I did not respond immediately. The sum presented was considerable, yet no monetary figure could adequately compensate for the irreplaceable trees lost, the poisoning of my soil, or the protracted period of gaslighting endured under a system designed for self-preservation. Nevertheless, the prospect of a written apology, duly signed and notarized for the entire community to read, held significant weight. "Take it," I conceded. "But I have one further condition." "And what is that?" Paul asked. "I require a clause inserted into the settlement stipulating that the HOA can never, under any circumstances, assert jurisdiction over my land again, not even symbolically. No voting rights, no flags, no petitions. I am to be excluded from their map entirely." A moment of silence followed on the line. Then Paul replied, "Consider it done." That evening, Denise stopped by, bearing a mason jar filled with pickled okra and a folded newspaper. "Have you seen this?" she inquired, handing me the Oak Summit Community Bulletin. It contained a reprint of the HOA's formal apology, a required component of the settlement agreement. The notice read, "The Oak Summit Homeowners Association formally apologizes to Mr. Dalton McCrae for the unauthorized actions taken on his property, including unpermitted drilling, environmental disturbance, and miscommunication with the community. We acknowledge the damage caused and commit to transparency moving forward." Beneath this statement in smaller, italicized print was the crucial clause. The HOA hereby waives any present or future claim over McRae Ridge in perpetuity. A smile touched my lips, not because the ordeal had concluded, but because the narrative was now irrevocably fixed and could not be altered. That weekend, neighbors organized a barbecue in the cleared community garden space. I received an invitation, though I did not cross the boundary into the HOA's designated territory. However, individuals subsequently visited my property. James arrived with sweet tea, and Denise brought lemon bars. Children darted through the tall grass, engaged in spirited chases along the gravel driveway, their shouts and laughter unburdened by the watchful eyes of someone wielding a clipboard and a rule book. As darkness descended, I sat beneath the starlit sky and observed the wind rustling through what had once been a battleground. Not a conflict of weaponry, but one of principles, and in that moment I apprehended a simple yet profound truth. They had sought to transform my land into a liability, but I had succeeded in forging it into a legacy. My land, my terms. Autumn arrived with a gentle golden hue that year, casting long shafts of sunlight through the sparse remaining trees, and a breeze that carried more the weight of memory than the chill of impending winter. By then, nearly a full year had elapsed since the HOA had first brought their drilling equipment onto my land, uninvited, unaccountable, and for a considerable period, unchallenged. However, circumstances had profoundly shifted. The drilling equipment was long gone. The borehole had been filled and sealed with concrete under state supervision, officially designated and recorded as a permanent geological risk zone. The contaminated portion of my property remained cordoned off, a stark testament to the depths of ignorance that can prevail when power operates without restraint. Yet, all else was beginning to regain its vitality. Where sulfur had once leached into the soil, resilient native grasses now grew, stubborn and verdant. The earth, which I had painstakingly amended and tilled by hand, had begun to yield results once more, modestly but authentically. Rows of robust vegetables sprouted in the raised beds. Bees hummed lazily amidst the wildflowers dotting the pasture's edge. Even the birds had returned, their morning songs no longer drowned out by the mechanical drone of machinery or the unsettling silence that followed. The land was in a process of healing, and so was I. The legal proceedings officially concluded 2 weeks after the settlement was reached. There was no trial, no appeals, only a finalized document bearing all requisite signatures, followed by the transfer of a check into a fund I had established specifically for land restoration and community environmental education. I named this initiative Root Line, for if there was one singular lesson I had absorbed, it was that the most critical struggles invariably occur beneath the surface, unseen until it is regrettably too late. However, Root Line was not conceived for my sole benefit. We constructed an open-air educational space at the far end of my property. It comprised 5 benches, a gravel pathway, and a wooden canopy fashioned from salvage beams from the old barn. Local schools began organizing field trips for their students. They would gather there, beneath the vast Colorado sky, notebooks in hand, while guest speakers, soil scientists, conservationists, and even Jack on occasion educated them on the importance of aquifer stewardship and the costly repercussions of negligence. One afternoon, a boy, approximately 10 years of age, raised his hand and inquired, why didn't the HOA simply offer an apology before matters escalated to such a degree? I lacked a facile answer, but I conveyed the unvarnished truth. Because, I explained, when individuals construct their world upon a foundation of control, acknowledging their errors feels tantamount to relinquishing everything, yet offering an apology is not an indication of weakness. It represents the initial step toward cultivating something superior. The boy nodded, diligently scribbled in his notebook, and then resumed his observation of the bees. Concurrently, the former HOA board members had effectively vanished from public life. Nancy Tillman disposed of her home and relocated out of state. Mark Fisher forfeited his professional license and suffered irreparable damage to his reputation. The remaining individuals dispersed through quiet departures, devoid of any public fanfare. The newly appointed interim board, to their credit, undertook a complete revision of the HOA's charter. They eliminated mandatory landscaping uniformity, instituted stringent transparency protocols, and established a homeowner oversight council. Furthermore, they implemented a complete prohibition on any future projects involving land situated beyond the HOA's ownership boundaries. One could scarcely imagine the irony. It took a catastrophic sulfur contamination event, 3 separate lawsuits, and the demise of half a forest to finally impress upon them the significance of respecting a boundary. Yet, the most unexpected manifestation of justice emanated from the neighbors themselves. I began receiving handwritten, heartfelt letters from residents who had previously regarded me with hostility from behind the steering wheels of their vehicles or had actively avoided eye contact in town. Some offered apologies, others simply expressed their gratitude. One gentleman penned, "I once believed you were merely angry. Now I comprehend that you were correct. You preserved more than just your land. You safeguarded ours as well." I preserved those letters in a box placed beside the fireplace, not for purposes of self-aggrandizement, but for grounding, because even after the protracted struggle and even amidst the shifting winds, there were nights when I would awaken in a state of tension, haunted by the lingering scent of sulfur or the disquieting sound of that drill piercing the earth. Trauma, too, possesses roots. They are simply not always visible. However, a profound sense of peace had been reclaimed, not the naive tranquility of assuming that individuals would inherently act honorably if left undisturbed, but a peace that had been hard-won, scarred, and possessed of the inherent capacity for self-defense. I dedicated that winter to completing the construction of a greenhouse. It was modest in scale, measuring only 12 feet in length, strategically positioned behind the barn, where it benefited perfectly from the morning sunlight. The inaugural tomato plant I nurtured within its confines grew with remarkable speed and vigor. I christened it Nancy, a subtle jest shared between myself and the soil. By springtime, McCrae Ridge was in full bloom. We convened a planting ceremony in April, precisely 1 year from the very day the HOA's drilling rig had first intruded upon my pasture. Dozens of individuals attended. Some brought seeds, while others contributed food items. James expertly grilled hot dogs, and Denise distributed wildflower bulbs. Even Barbara, who had subsequently assumed a position on the new board's ethics committee, delivered a brief address extolling the virtues of being gracious, humble, honest. And when the appointed time arrived, we all knelt together, gently placing seedlings into the receptive earth. My hand trembled slightly as I pressed the soil around my own seedling, a cottonwood, tall and slender, just beginning to unfurl its leaves. I understood it would outlast me. That was the reason for my selection. Later, a small child from the vicinity, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, approached and inquired if I was the individual who halted the contamination. I chuckled and then knelt down to her level. "No," I responded. "I'm simply the person who chose to observe." She embraced me. No inquiries, no fuss. Just that pure, clear-eyed thankfulness that only a child can offer. It moved me deeply. That evening, I was seated on the veranda, a canine at my feet, the cosmos above, and contemplated all that this territory had weathered, all that we had overcome. And I reflected on how vindication isn't always boisterous. It doesn't invariably arrive with prominent news stories or financial compensations. At times, justice is understated. Occasionally, it flourishes in hushed circumstances. Sometimes, it manifests as a sapling stretching towards the heavens on soil, no longer held captive by dread, but by righteousness. And as I reclined, closed my eyes, and inhaled the refreshing evening atmosphere, the scent of sulfur was no longer present.